Dear participants, colleagues from the ANCHISE Consortium, project partners, fellow researchers, colleagues and friends of our institutions, thank you very much for joining us today for the 5th ANCHISE Talk webinar dedicated on provenance research and methods. I am Hélène Ventimiglia, project coordinator in the Heritage Protection Department of the International Council of Museums, ICOM, which is part of the ANCHISE Consortium. If you are joining us today for the first time, ANCHISE, standing for Applying New Solutions for Cultural Heritage Protection by Innovative Scientific, Social and Economic Engagement, is a Horizon Europe project dedicated to the fight against illicit trafficking and looting of cultural goods across Europe. However, as you already may know, ANCHISE is also a symbol. In Greek and Roman mythologies, he's a father carried on the back of his son Aeneas out of the crumbled city of Troy. This name recalls the duty we have to protect our cultural heritage. So ANCHISE project started in early 2023 for 3 years, along with 2 other European projects of its cluster, Aurora and Enigma. And ANCHISE crosses the methodology of networking that has proved its efficiency with previous Horizon 2020 Nature projects. ANCHISE aims to offer comprehensive and replicable solution matching the needs of the professionals of all fields involved in our shared fight. In order to understand and include this very rich community, the ANCHISE project constitutes a joint initiative involving 15 partners from all over Europe, composed by researchers, practitioners from the law enforcement services and cultural heritage sector, including museums, technological tools developers, and community managers. Amongst its numerous actions, the project carries extended research work meant at nurturing a thorough understanding of social, political, and economic contexts of the looting and the illicit trafficking of cultural goods. In this order, the researchers whom we are listening to during the ANCHISE talks are experts on the phenomenon as well as on the solutions developed against it. And for today's session, we are delighted to be introducing you to Anne-Lise Guigues, who is a PhD student in Oriental Archaeology at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne and the École du Louvre, as well as chargée de mission at the Department of Oriental Antiquities at the Louvre. She is also a doctoral associate at the Institut Français du Proche-Orient and a member of ANCHISE Young Researchers Committee. So as Marco said, and as I said also at the beginning of this introduction, this ANCHISE talk session will be dedicated to the topic of provenance research and methods. And in this regard, Anne-Lise's presentation will be followed by a discussion and exchange session with all the participants. So thank you very much. And now we will listen to Anne-Lise for her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hélène. Yes. Thank you, Hélène. And first of all, I would like to thank Irene, Marco, at the French School of Athens for inviting me to take part in the ANCHISE Talks webinar and for giving me the opportunity to talk with Hélène Ventimiglia from ICOM. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk about provenance research and possible methods. For the past 3 years, I have been researching the provenance and the history of objects purchased by the Near-Eastern Antiquities Department of the Louvre between 1918 and 1970, without considering the cuneiform tablets, which require knowledge of ancient languages. I have catalogued 1,558 objects and traced their journey from the archaeological sites to the museum. I'm going to present here the methodology I followed to carry out this research. Also, I'm sure there could be many other ways. What is provenance research? To put this research into context, we can quickly review the different meanings of provenance research. There is no single definition of provenance because it is a complex interdisciplinary field of research. First, provenance research has a legal understanding. This definition applies to the art market and underlines the ownership of the object. This sense of provenance research is also understood in the context of new acquisitions by museums and the obligation of due diligence. This necessary involves diplomatic issues with the notion of restitution. The second meaning concerns the museum context. Provenance research is the history of collections. It includes research done by curators and archivists for publication, exhibitions, and inventory research. And the third meaning is in archaeology. Provenance can also mean the excavation site, the site where the object was created, or the origin of the materials. If the date of 1970 is considered a key date, provenance research or documentation of provenance in Anglo-Saxon discussion does not seem to be limited to this date. It is a process or method that some see as akin to object biography and can be applied to a variety of issues, period, object types, and geographic areas. These aspects make provenance research a complex field, bringing together several definitions, mixing legal, historical, archaeological, sociological, and economic issues, but which all come together with a single objective to reconstruct the identity card to the object and this path from point A to point B. During my research for my thesis and for the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, I used the inventories as a starting point to try and reconstruct the entire journey of the objects from their site to the museum. There were very few tools for data on auction sales and Near Eastern antiquities in the 20th century. Database existed for the art market during the Second World War, but only Anne-Elisabeth Dunbattery from the Met had begun to research Near Eastern antiquities during this period. It was therefore necessary to create these tools, which could then be used to conduct rapid research on antiquities from the Middle East. I would like to briefly present the different sources and methodologies I have used for my research. Then we will look at how this data can be used to create tools for documenting the provenance of objects offered for sale and how museum research and archives can help in the fight against illicit trafficking. How can museums trace where objects in their collections came from? So what sources and method can be used? Knowing the sourcing available in the various archive centers is the first step in building up a corpus of data that will make it possible to document the provenance of the antiquities. These files vary in nature. They are generally kept in national archives, museums, department archives, diplomatic archives, and are sometimes difficult to find, for example, in shipping company archives. Of course, archives are not always in the same language, and transcribing and translating documents is essential for extracting information. To trace the provenance of the 105,050 objects purchased by the Louvre Department of the Near Eastern Antiquities, I consult the archives of around 50 archive centers in 11 countries. This represents 84,000 archive documents. But how can this data be brought together and organized to trace the provenance of objects and create useful tools for the museum? The method for tracing an object can vary according to the specificities, the geographical areas, and the actors. If the process generally follows the same step, there are many different ways to search for the provenance of an object. The first step is to take stock of how the collections have been built up. From this purchase, donation, or bequest, three cases can arise. Either the objects come from an archaeologist, and therefore, at this point, it may have been acquired following an excavation or following a purchase from a dealer or an intermediary when the archaeologist has constituted a private collection. The second case, an object acquired from an active dealer based in Paris or in a European capital or from a collector. the dealer or the collector, sometimes they can even be a dealer and a collector, may have previously bought it either at auction or from an intermediary located near the site where the object was found. And the third case, an object acquired at auction. According to the sale catalog, the object could have previously come from an old private collection, from a dealer's collection, and or have already been sold on the art market at auction a few years earlier. If we go back up the chain of ownership of the object for each of these three cases, we now arrive at the point where the object was taken out of an archaeological site, either during excavations or during commercial excavation when they are authorized in the country, like in Iran, or during clandestine excavation. Based on the location of the excavation area, research can still specify the origin of the object and thus make us switch from the search for provenance with A to the search for the provenance with E. Very often, the indications are missing and do not allow us to go that far in the research. However, it is possible to bring together stylistic and scientific studies and archival research in order to specify the name of the discovery sites. By using the archives of scientific excavation, which sometimes mention episodes of clandestine excavation, by consulting customs archives when they have been preserved in the countries where the excavations took place, and by comparing the dates of appearance on the art market of this type of object with the geopolitical context. Thus, it will sometimes be possible to start from the object and its indicated provenance to follow its path. However, if the object is not sufficiently described, if there is no specificity that allows it to be easily recognized in a sales catalog, this methodology will not be sufficient to retrace the object's path. It is then necessary to change direction and to turn towards research that does not concern the object, but the dealer or the collector. This logic consists in searching for all the information available on the previous owner: biographical elements, activities, contacts, addresses, press articles mentioning him, genealogical research to be able to include him in a network and understand his means of supply. By adopting a more global approach to the art market and the history of dealers' network, it may then be possible to deduce the path of an object. Unfortunately, if the object has not been photographed, if the object is described, for example, as a quote, vase from Syria, it may never be possible to be certain of its provenance and path. But by studying the networks and flows of antiquities in the 20th century, we can go further in the process of tracing the object. This other graph underlines the complementarity of the information that can be used to find the origin of an object. It is the accumulation of all this data that will allow the objects to be placed in the context of the art market of the time. To reconstruct this history, the data must be cross-referenced. The history of the object is made up of geographical data, the site of origin, data on the object, typological data, and historical data, the previous owner. This historical data makes it possible to identify the networks of players involved using biographical data, data on sales of antiquities by the dealers, and data on their business. The documentation of their activities, business data, enable us to understand the circulation of objects. Export licenses contain movement data, typological data, and geographical data. This then makes it possible to define the origin of the objects and document clandestine excavation. Data on dealers, police and custom reports, as well as data on the regulations in force, enable us to identify the types of objects being looted. This object data can then be used to cross-reference moments of clandestine excavations with auction sales to refine our knowledge of the circulation of antiquities. This flow data cross-references information from auctions and sellers. Together, There's 5 categories organize the data to provide an overall understanding of the circulation of objects and the art market, from archaeological sites to museums and collectors. This methodology and data organization, which are obviously not the only ways of researching provenance, underline the tools that can be built up from museum research and archives to understand the art markets and combat illicit trafficking today. Studying the history of museum collections helps us to understand the evolution of acquisition policies and attitudes, the regulations governing antiquities, and to better understand the mechanism of the 20th century circulation channels, which have influenced those of today. All this data has been used to map the main antiquities trading points in the 20th century. These epicenters are the major cities of Iran, like Tehran, Iraq, Baghdad, Istanbul, Beirut, and Jerusalem. The dealers, who were authorized by the Antiquities Department to trade in antiquities, were located close to the hotel and tourist centers that sprang up in the Middle East in the first half of the 20th century. From these trading points, the first traffic routes could be identified, linked to ports such as Beirut and Istanbul, or Izmir, Haifa, Basra, and Bushehr. These routes linked the countries of the Middle East to the mandatory states. For example, Iraq had a privileged route with England, and Syria and Lebanon with France. When we go into more detail, this data can help us to understand the movement of objects by looking at quantitative, qualitative, and typological data. Here you have an example of what can be found in archival collections to understand the circulation of antiquities. The archives of the Antiquities Department or Ministries of Culture contain valuable information on sales of antiquities by dealers in the 20th century. In some cases, shop inventories have been preserved. Photographs of artworks also document the movement of these objects. On the left, you see an invoice from the Greek dealer Christodoulou. In the center, the inventory of a dealer store. And on the right, you see an export authorization kept in Nicosia at the State Archives, and example in the center of photographs of objects kept in all these documents. In 2022 and 2023, thanks to the Institut Français du Proche-Orient, I was able to visit Beirut and consult the archives of the Department of Antiquities during the mandatory period and after Lebanon's independence. This data, which documents the circulation of antiquities throughout the 20th century, allows us to compare different political situations and better understand the evolutions of the circulation. After studying all the archives from the period of the French Mandate, I spent 2 months working with the Lebanese General Directorate of Antiquities to consult, translate, and transcribe the export authorization held in Beirut between 1955 and 1970. This data, extracted from the archives and entered in a simple Excel spreadsheet, accurately records the date, the exporter's name, the means of export, the destination, the number and description of the objects, and the export authorization number. As this authorization includes photographs, it was possible to work with the General Directorate of Antiquities to find out where some of the antiquities were kept today. My last research visit ended on October 2023, and it's not been possible for the time being to continue this work with the DGA, but the aim is to continue processing the archives up to the period of the civil war in Lebanon. By matching this data with exports from Lebanon between 1934 and 1970, we can see the evolution of exports between the mandate period, it's the green points on this map, and after the independence, the red points. we can see destinations change, with France predominating during the mandate period and a significant increase in export to the United States, Switzerland, and Japan after the Second World War. The flow of objects between 1955 and 1970 was very significant, with around 116,000 items legally exported from Lebanon between 1955 and 1970. The top map shows authorized exports between 1934 and 1940, while the bottom shows authorized exports between 1955 and 1970. We can see the evolution of the flow of antiquities between the mandate period and Lebanon's independence. These informations make it possible to check whether objects described as belonging to such and such a collection before 1970 or sold by such and such a dealer were indeed exported legally, as well as providing information about the history of collections and possible maps. This data also documents the actors. The collection of archives provides tools to help authenticate the documents and signature of antique dealers. The archives sometimes contain fingerprints, like on the left, photographs, all dealer invoices, letterheads, and authentic signatures of dealers on the right, for example. A better knowledge of active dealers, their period of activity, the name of intermediaries, and their sources of supply may prove useful in spotting the false origins of objects currently circulating on the art market. By cross-referencing information on dealers' activities, networks emerge that highlight the links between them. These links show that the name on the archives or museum inventory is not necessarily the name of the real seller. And the closer you get to the archaeological site, the more players there are. Nodes and links emerge, revealing the names of key players in the trade and circulation of antiquities. For example, as on the first slide, green are the names of dealers who sold directly to the Louvre, purple the name of dealers who sometimes acted as intermediaries, but we have a trade licenses. Also, orange is for dealers who excavated clandestinely. If provenance research were to end with the name of the dealer who owned the object or the name of the former collection, a whole part of the provenance would remain unknown. This also shows that archives are lifeless and that if there is no comparison of information, it is difficult to understand the object's entire history. It is therefore easy to jump to wrong conclusions, even if the entire history of the object is sometimes difficult to reconstruct because of the disappearance of certain archives. Initially, I wanted to code database in SQL, but time was short, and I only made Excel database, which could then be used in the SQL database. At the end of these years of research, 4 databases were created. In addition to the catalog listing all the origin of objects purchased by the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, 1 database documents Near Eastern antiquities sold at the public auction in Paris during the 20th century. A database lists all export authorizations from Lebanon, and a database lists all objects offered for purchase but refused, whether forgeries or too high a price. Also, like an investigation to do provenance research is to physically retrace the path of the object to find the archive proving its passage, whichever year, at whichever place. Thus, it is to cumulate the archives of the source countries, the archives of the receiving countries, and the archives of the antique dealers. Not only does this methodology make it possible to document the history of the circulation of antiquities in the 20th century and the history of the collection of the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, but all this research also make it possible to provide the museum with tools to help combat illicit trafficking. We will look now at 2 recent cases. The first example shows the link between research based on museum archives and art market monitoring. At the beginning on this month, a Sumerian statuette dating from the 3rd millennium BC was sold by Sotheby's. My colleague Isabelle Fillon, who monitors daily the art market, emailed me this statue and a photograph. The auction house website indicates the following provenance, I quote, say to have been on the New York art market, then in Paris, Baumgartner collection, Frankfurt, acquired circa 1955 from Heinrich, Frankfurt, by descent to the present owner, 2015. Geographically, this statuette comes from Mesopotamia. Having looked through the archives of the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, the photograph reminded me of an antiquity that had been offered for purchase to André Parrot, director of the Department of Near Eastern Antiquities, in 1953. In February 1953, the year of his death, the dealer Ernest Asher offered André Parrot 2 Sumerian statuettes depicting orators from the 3rd millennium BC. Photographs of the 2 objects are kept in the department and make it possible to recognize the statue sold at Sotheby's. André Parrot refused these 2 antiquities because they were fakes. The first example shows that research into provenance of permanent museum collection, accompanied by an art market monitoring, makes it possible to establish links between data and document the provenance of antiques passing through the art market today. The second example shows the importance of studying the history of clandestine excavation on our archaeological sites to identify problematic objects for sale. Last November, Nicole and Jean-Michel Thierry's collection was sold at Hôtel Drouot in Paris. Several objects, amulets, and a sharpener handle were described as having been, I quote, acquired from Koutoulakis in March 1955, and most of the objects would have come from Mary and would have been traded in Baghdad between 1953 and 1955. First, by comparing them with objects from Mary held in the Louvre, the geographical origin of these objects may prove to be correct. This time, research into the history of clandestine excavations on archaeological sites, where there have been French missions in particular, can help to document the provenance of these objects. The Mary site went through a period of looting and clandestine excavations during the Second World War. The research I carried out for my thesis enabled me to summarize which objects were stolen and the events that took place during this period. Between 1941 and 1942, between the departure of General Dent's troops and the arrival of Allied troops, the site and the site house were looted. The small museum was also emptied, and Pierre Hamelin, who had excavating during André Parrot's mission before the war, and who was on site, led an investigation to find the objects. He met Cher Mohamed El Orsa, who told him that he knew the names of those who had looted Mary, but that he couldn't say anything at the moment. He did say, however, that there was nothing left in the surrounding villages and that all the objects has crossed the border. The mention of the Iraqi antique dealer echoes the mention of Baghdad in the Thierry sale of Mary's object. But who is this Iraqi antique dealer? There is no name, but one of the antique dealers active during this period was Elias Salomon David. During the Second World War, he continued to sell to several museums, including the Yale Babylonian collection. Archives show that he kept contacts in Baghdad during this period. Active in Paris before the war, he may have helped to circulate objects stolen from Mary. As for Nicolas Koutoulakis, he was close to Lebanese antiquities dealer and was active in Crete, Paris, and Geneva, especially from the 1950s onwards. He specialized in classical Iranian and Iraqi antiquities. The case of the small amulet on the right is particularly interesting as the selling price is very high. The site indicates in small letters Mary with a question mark, then puts a photograph of a newspaper article published in the 20th century where it says from Baghdad. In this way, the mention of the Mary site could go completely unnoticed. Also, these antiquities circulated the object before the 1970s and the date of the new UNESCO Convention. There are still objects that were stolen either during the Second World War and during the 1953 excavation at the Mary site. So, what importance should be attached to these indications of origin? How do we know that the object really comes from Mary? The dealer may have given this location in order to sell the antiques at a higher price, for example. Indication of provenance can sometimes document the provenance of objects before 1970, but do not resolve all the problems associated with the context in which the objects circulated. These amulets may have been stolen from Mary, transported illegally to Iraq, sold by an antique dealer in Baghdad, transported to Paris, and then bought by Nicole and Jean-Michel Thierry. To conclude, the history of museum collections make it possible to gather a few archives that document not only the context in which objects were acquired, but also their circulation and the art market at different times. This data can be used to gain a better understanding of today's network and the mechanism by which antiquities are smuggled out of the countries. Research into export authorization has shown that if 115,000 objects were exported from Lebanon between 1955 and 1970, this figure would have to be multiplied by the number of countries in the Middle East and then multiplied again to obtain the number of objects exported illegally. Thanks to research into museums' permanent collections, it is possible to create tools to help in the fight against illicit trafficking. These tools may not be a direct means of combating illicit trafficking, but they do offer tools for monitoring and verifying the indications of origin given by the various players. They are also a means of creating ever greater cooperation. Thank you for your attention, and let's talk. Let's talk.
Thank you very much, Anne-Lise, for this very structured and comprehensive presentation on provenance research methods. It's always better to have concrete application examples to understand the concepts as you did and how methodology can be applied in real life. So thank you very much for this insightful presentation. As we can see, cooperation is also key in this process, and it reminds us the importance of cooperating in the ANCHISE project as well. Now, to open up the Q&A session, I would like to ask you some questions, Anne-Lise, and this will also allow the participants to think about their questions and write them in the chat in the meantime. So I have three main questions, but if you want, you can reply to two of them and we can keep the third one for later. So the first one would be, in the course of your own work or your own research, have you identified any particular gaps in provenance research? So in Near Eastern antiquities in the 20th century, precisely. And you already presented it during your presentation, but are there some actions in place to overcome these gaps and challenges? Are there tools, specific tools or methods already put in place for this purpose, for these specific gaps that you observed? And the third one is really related to the ANCHISE project. In your opinion, how technology could help in this process?
Thank you, Hélène, for these questions. About the first question, yes, there are major gaps in the archives because my research was based on the archives kept in Beirut, because it is not possible today to consult the archives in Iran, Iraq, or Syria. And diplomatic relations between the countries of the Middle East have to be taken into account when accessing the archives. If we were to extend these to the early 20th century, we would also have to take into account the Ottoman archives, which would require us to read the archives in Ottoman Turkish. It is another limit to this research. And one of the difficulties of studying this region is that there is at least 5 different languages to be familiar with. And about the tools, it could be useful to develop tools, for example, for reading handwritten archives, and also the ICOM red list are tools that can help a museum combat illicit trafficking. Because if we look at the typology of objects circulating between 1955 and 1970, we find the same types of antiquities that are referenced on the ICOM red list. And if you want to talk about ICOM red list.
Yes, thank you, Anne-Lise, first for your replies on the first questions. And actually, yes, as you said, the diplomatic relationships are very important in the process. And about the ICOM red lists, actually, yeah, you can see my background full of ICOM red lists, but you may already know this tool created by ICOM. And just to remind, their purpose is to contribute to the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural property by helping art and heritage professionals, as well as law enforcement agencies, in the identification of the objects and typologies of objects, as you said, at risk of theft and illicit export and trafficking. So the red lists function as an alert, and the objects that are on the red list are not stolen objects. They are objects which are at risk. And we have 3 main criteria to include an object in a red list. First of all, it has to be at risk of theft. Second, on demand in the art market. And third, it has to be protected by national legislations. And when we have these 3 criteria, we can work with experts from museums and choose the objects that will be included in the red list. So the message relayed by the red list is very, very clear. If you encounter a cultural object that looks like one of those featured in the red list, you must carefully research its origin. As such, the ICOM red list underlined the importance of provenance research and complete documentation, also in line with the ICOM standards. So in that way, we can say that ICOM red list can contribute to provenance research via the global aim of the identification of an object. And actually, sometimes, often they are used in this process of provenance research. So I have a concrete examples that can echo your presentation, because it's about an object that was from Iraq. So it's an example of the use of the red list in the framework of a cooperation process that resulted in the return of Iraqi object from several Iraqi objects from the Netherlands to Iraq. What happened? So it was in May 2021, so several years ago, 7 archaeological artifacts were returned to the Iraqi ambassador in the Netherlands by Dutch authorities, meaning the ambassador for international cultural cooperation of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the director of the Information and Heritage Inspectorate, so responsible authorities in the Netherlands. How it started. So this case of these artifacts came to light when a Dutch private collector offered the objects to an auction house. This was the first step. This was a composition, as I said, of 7 objects, including foundation cones, clay tablets, and 2 figurines. Then, after receiving a report from a concerned individual, the Information and Heritage Inspectorate in the Netherlands made an inquiry jointly with an expert from the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities. So here we can see the importance of the role of museum professionals in this process. And this inquiry confirmed that the objects came from Iraq and were of great cultural importance as they were testimony of the Mesopotamian civilization. Indeed, the foundation cones were large clay cones that were once set into walls buildings or buried into the foundation of temples. Then both the cones and the tablet were inscribed with cuneiform texts, so really a testimony of the ancient civilization. And while one of the figurines was identified as a Halaf figurine representing the mother goddess, so a symbol of fertility, and used in sacrificial rituals, the other figurine was identified as Ram, used as an amulet or a stamp or seal. And all these objects were thus of great cultural importance, testimony of the cultural heritage of Iraq. And so now that we put the context on how the Red List played a role in this process, actually the investigation made by the Dutch authorities and with the expert from the museum revealed that these archaeological artifacts were very similar to objects included in the ICOM Red List of Iraqi objects at risk. And if you want to consult this Red List, it's available on the ICOM website. So actually there are 2 versions. One, the first one in 2003, and then an update in 2015. So as the objects were on the red list, this was an indicator of their vulnerability to theft, plundering, and illicit export from their country of origin. And as mentioned before, the fact that an item is included in a red list is an alert to encourage further investigation about its provenance. So then when the investigation was on, it was found that in line with the international convention and legislation, in line with the UN Security Council resolution establishing a system of sanctions to protect Iraq's cultural heritage, these objects were protected under the Iraq Sanctions Order of 2004. Section 2, a system that has been implemented in the European law, and therefore the Iraqi government requested the Dutch government to return the cultural artifacts. And then, considering all these elements and also the relationship between the countries, the cooperation between these different actors resulted in the return of the objects to Iraq. So yeah, to wrap up, this example shows the importance of cooperation, of good relationships as well, the role of expertise that museums can play in this process, and the importance of using existing tools, as the red lists, for example, as an incentive to connect all the actors directly or indirectly involved in the provenance research. And another crucial aspect, however, is legislations, as we have seen also in this example, at a national level, as well as compliance with international conventions, which ICOM always encourages. So yeah, that was a concrete example also from ICOM side, because we always see the red list, but it's also important to remind that they are part of this important process. So yeah, then to move forward, we have another question going on for you, Anne-Lise, before the other question from the public. In your opinion, how technology could help to go further in this process?
New technologies could help to create database containing photos of an object listed uh, with detailed information on where they were circulated on the art market or offered to museum. And it may be interesting to develop a more automated art market monitoring using informatics and digital tools. But this raises the question of rights because while the archives of the Ministry of Culture in France or in French museums are public, archives abroad are not necessarily freely accessible, and some archives have not yet been inventoried or digitized. So this.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne-Lise. Yeah, of course, it's always a matter of authorizations and access, but yeah, thank you for these points of reflection. And I can see, to continue on our discussion, that we already have some questions in the chat. If you want, I can read them to then reply. For now, yeah, we have 3 interventions, and one of the question is divided in different questions, but we can start from the question from Eko Anye. I hope I pronounce your name well. Sorry if I don't. And the question is, have you ever encountered ethical considerations in presenting provenance findings? So it's related to that what you said, particularly when they challenge the legitimacy of an institution's holding and how you deal with it.
Thank you for these questions. So, of course, ethical consideration is a matter, and my job is to gather the documents that contain the most information on objects, legal information, historical information, provenance information, and my aim is to document, and after that, I give the files to the institution, and after there is more discussions to create cooperation and include ethical considerations. So I don't know if it's answer of your question, Echo.
Well, thank you, Anne-Lise. I don't know if Echo would like to react then, but yeah, I think it was a comprehensive question, and it's always a tricky question when we touch these ethical subjects. Then, so we can go to the other questions, which also we have another question from Erika Bochereau. So yeah, Echo says thank you. So I think you replied to his question. So we have another question, which actually it's divided in 3 questions on the object that you researched. The first of all, it's how much time did you spend on average for each object? Second question, how many were you not able to determine the provenance? And third, how many objects were you able to determine had illicit origins? So I don't know if you can provide the numbers, but here is the question.
For the time, I don't know what is the time I spend for each object, but in 3 years, I have studied 1,500 objects. so you can maybe calculate the time, but the most of the time is especially for the consultation of archives and the consultation in Beirut, in Nicosia, in Athens. And for the second question, how many objects? I think there is 5 objects of all the objects purchased by the Nearston Antiquities department, for which I don't determine the provenance. But for the illicit origins, I did research on the purchase between 1918 and 1970. So there is very few objects may be concerned, but it is not a concern in comparison of the Convention of 1970 of UNESCO.
Thank you, Anne-Lise, for your complete answer. And yeah, your work is really impressive about the research of these subjects and consultation of archives. And Erika says thank you for your reply. And then we have a last question for now from Maria Claudia Bodino. And it's about the state of the art about data models in this domain and related adoption. So I don't know if you have any insight on that. So yeah, the state of the art about data models.
For the data models, there is maybe the study with the logiciel GEFI. It's a program to create networks with Excel spreadsheets, and is also data models developed by Léa de Saint-Raymond in France to create a to create the models of data on the art markets data.
Thank you. Very, very interesting as well. For now, I think we don't have other questions in the chat. So I don't know if other participants would like to ask last questions, because we are approaching the end of the discussion. But yeah, and then I can also let the floor to Marco and Irene, who were hosting this webinar.
Yes, I was waiting for other questions, but I see that I mean, we had a lot of participation to this webinar. Thank you very much, Anne-Lise, and thank you very much, Hélène, for guiding the conversation. Definitely was a very good moment for us all to meet before the holidays. Let's say also that this is a moment for us to say goodbye to 2024, to all the achievements of this year. Before closing this session, if I don't know if there is anyone who wants to take the floor, but before closing this session, I want you to remind you that ANCHISE is a project funded by the European Union under Horizon Europe. On the display, if you correctly see my screen, you should be seeing all the partners of the project and also the website that we are renovating, but especially Twitter and LinkedIn we are almost reaching 1,000 followers on LinkedIn. So if you want to join us before the 1,000, you are more than welcome to do so. And by that, I can say goodbye to everyone. Hélène, I don't know if you have any final words. And Lise, I leave you the floor, and then we end the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Marco, if I may. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar about the provenance research and methods. Thank you very much to EFA. I just would like to mention another action from ICOM concerning this thematic, because actually we have a call for papers currently published on the ICOM website and also relayed by the ANCHISE project, because ICOM is preparing an issue of Museum International on provenance research in museums, about principles, practices, and possibilities. And in this framework, we have a call for papers for a publication, and the abstract submission deadline is January 2025. So I know that we have a great community of researchers in ANCHISE, so you are welcome to submit your abstract if it's not already done. And you can find more information on the ICOM website, also in the ANCHISE website. So yeah, that was all from my side, and thank you very much. I also wish you a great holiday season and a fresh start of next year.
And on behalf of the coordinator, I just wanted to chime in and to thank Anne-Lise again and again for the huge work that she did for this webinar, and the entire team from the École du Louvre and its direction who join in very districtly today and support our work. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Anne-Lise, again and again.
Thanks to everyone. See you.
See you.
Thank you.
Have a nice holiday.